Well, good morning, everyone. I am Brian Chung of Yahoo Finance here at the International Monetary Fund, kicking off a number of discussions about papers that we'll be previewing next week's annual meeting here in Washington, D.C. And sitting down with me is one of the great researchers here at the IMF from the Research Department, John Bludorn. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much for speaking with me.
So, paper that just dropped right now, the title of it, Closer Together or Further Apart, Within Country Regional Disparities and Adjustment in Advanced Economies. For those that are maybe going through the paper right now, summarize the key findings from this paper and why it's important.
So, one of the key goals for the fund is to try to achieve more inclusive growth, and the regional dimension is one part of that. So, country level differences are important, obviously, but within country differences are also important, and that can sometimes be masked if we just focus on the country level. So in this work we look at kind of those regional disparities, and in particular for advanced economies, where we see that since about the 80s, those regional disparities have kind of gone up. So what do I mean by regional disparities? I mean kind of differences in real GDP per capita across regions. There's also been kind of slower kind of regional convergence, so it's kind of slowed down, meaning that some regions are kind of pulling away, kind of doing really well, and some are not doing as well as kind of the average.
Now, you mentioned it's not just GDP per capita in the paper that, it is part of the regional disparities that you were measuring, right? It's things like health outcomes, labor productivity, employment shares, and even what types of sectors those employment shares are in, right? Tell me a little bit more about that and why regional disparities isn't just necessarily income.
Yeah, so I mean, in particular in this work, right, so why regional disparities are rising is sometimes complex. Right. Part of it can be that regions that are well performing do even better, and then there are, but what we're more focused on in this work is that there are some regions that have started out kind of poorly, and they're not catching up, and those the lagging regions. And as you highlighted, one of the findings that we see in this chapter is that lagging regions tend to actually do poorly on a number of dimensions. Some are that they tend to have worse health outcomes, so like lower life expectancy. They tend to have lower educational attainment. They tend to have higher long-term unemployment rates. So it means that, if you're in these regions, you're just on average more likely to be long-term unemployed. We also see that they tend to be more specialized in different sectors than other regions within countries. So lagging regions tend to be more specialized in agriculture and industry compared to other regions, and meaning that they have more employment in those sectors.
So you mentioned the idea of lagging regions. This is kind of novel research because you're not, though, just looking at one advanced economy. You're looking at many advanced economies in the scope of your data sets. So help us kind of understand what the definition of a lagging region is. Is that the difference between urban and suburban areas? Is the difference between states and one another? What is kind of the definition of a lagging region?
So we have a very broad sample of the advanced economies that we're looking at here. So we can't get into, we don't have the level of granularity or detail to get really in-depth at kind of like city level or sometimes metropolitan statistical area. That would be a lot of data. So what we do have, though, are these so-called first-level administrative units. So these are like U.S. states or German Länder. So it's that level that we're talking about regions. And so that's kind of the level that we're talking about regions. And when we're talking about lagging, we're talking about looking really at that period of about the past 2 decades. So we're looking at regions that are below the median real GDP per capita in like 2000 relative to their own country, and then that they grew slower than the country as a whole.
Right.
And so that's how we kind of figure out who's lagging and who's not. And what you see is about 20% of regions in our overall sample of advanced economies are lagging, and it's very different. Some countries have lagging regions, some countries don't.
So when you kind of unpack the kind of micro foundations of these regions, you can look at labor, you can look at capital. Your paper focused a lot on labor and specifically kind of tested out the differences in different types of shocks, right? One being trade shocks and the other being technology-related shocks, and the effect to which that might contribute to some of these labor markets not being able to adapt, which leaves them behind, which leaves them lagging. So tell me a little bit more about the difference between the trade and the tech shocks that can kind of leave regions behind.
Yeah, so as you highlighted, yeah, we're trying to kind of understand a bit better what's going on with these lagging regions, and in particular focus on the role of the trade and technology shocks that have been discussed a lot over the past few years as potentially driving inequality, among other things. So in this case, we're looking at kind of the consequences of those trade and technology shocks, I'll define in a sec, on unemployment at the regional level, and how does regional unemployment change in response to these kind of shocks. And for the trade shock, it's really an increase in competition in external markets for the goods that a given region kind of produces. Yeah. If that goes up, that's an adverse trade shock.
Right.
And then for the
so it would boost unemployment.
And what we see is that there is some movement in unemployment, but interestingly, on average, it may vary for specific regions, but on average across advanced economies, those adverse trade shocks don't tend to have lasting unemployment effects. Right. We do see a little bit of a dip in labor force participation initially, like in the year after kind of one of these shocks, but that really kind of unwinds.
And you looked at China even specifically as an example, right? How do you test for that? How do you kind of create that shock in your modeling to see what the effects are?
So we're motivated off of some very prominent research done by some academic researchers, Otter, Dorn, and Hansen, which look at how the rise of Chinese productivity led to increased competition in other markets because China basically became much more productive over time. And so that's the kind of the trade shock that we're looking at here, is that rise in competition that a region in an advanced economy might experience with the rise of China. And like as I said, what we see is that on average for advanced economies, we don't see that a big negative unemployment effect at the regional level.
Right.
But that's an average, you know.
Your mileage will vary depending on.
Yeah. By contrast, we see the technology shock, which
is more permanent, right?
Yes, it tends to have this much more lasting. That we see that an adverse technology shock, and that's defined as there's been a decrease in the relative cost of machinery and equipment goods. And if you're a region that tends to have production that's more vulnerable to automation, or more able to be easily automated, that tends to, we tend to see that unemployment in those regions with those characteristics getting subject to these shocks, it tends to rise.
So having said that, it seems like, I mean, a lot of the headlines right now are being dominated by the China trade negotiations, but so is the message from the paper that labor markets should be more mindful about automation than these kind of temporary trade discussions? Is that kind of the message?
Well, I guess, you know, what we see is that the trade shocks on average don't have these long-lasting effects. And the technology shocks do have these more long-lasting effects. And in fact, if you're a lagging region, they tend to be even bigger.
Right.
So, which suggests that there's something about technology shocks that, and labor market adjustment in particular in lagging regions that's not working quite well. And so that then leads to, you know, trying to think about policies that may help ease that adjustment to those kinds of shocks.
So let's go into that. What types of policies would help these lagging regions, which maybe aren't as adaptable to a trade shock as maybe the more successful regions, if you will? What types of structural reforms could be done to help those lagging regions not lag so much?
Yeah, so we look at how national policies, so we've got this big sample of advanced economies, different countries, they have different kind of national policies related to how labor markets and product markets function, how kind of flexible they're allowed to be, how open they are, and we use those differences to kind of look at how regional labor market adjustment may differ with those national policies. And what we see is that if you have labor markets that are more kind of flexible and open, they tend to actually have much dampened unemployment effects from technology shocks, and really almost no effect then from like trade shocks. So what we see there then is that these kind of that flexibility really helps.
And lastly, why is this important, right? It's obviously not a good thing to hear that disparity is increasing within advanced economies, but you note in the paper that it can result in things like fueling discontent, political polarization. Why is that important?
So that's another aspect, right? This one of the fund's goals is for more inclusive growth, and there's some work that suggests that regional disparities, in particular in these kind of labor market outcomes, which we tend to we're focused a bit more on in this chapter, that they can be associated with, if you've got big differences in unemployment, and some regions are experiencing big rises, they tend to see an erosion of social trust, which is, for social cohesion, national cohesion is not a good thing in terms of effectiveness of policies, and basically just kind of ensuring that individuals, because that's what it ends up being about, are really lifted up, or supported.
All right. Yeah. Well, again, this paper, Closer Together or Further Apart, Within-Country Regional Disparities and Adjustment in Advanced Economies. Again, John Bludorn. Again, you also had a team with you.
Yeah, yeah, it's a team effort. It's always a team effort here at the fund.
And again, John Bludorn with the research department here at the IMF. But again, you can check this paper out online. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks very much, Brian.
All right, thanks.
Bye.